Before the Tet Offensive, Robert Kennedy's bid for president, and LBJ's shocking announcement. Before the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, and riots across the country. Before a tumultuous Democratic convention in Chicago and the election of Richard Nixon as president. Before all this, in 1968, there was Senator Eugene McCarthy, better known as Gene. In late 1967, he stood up alone and something happened. Oh, did it ever. This is his story. Say hi, Gene, and let's meet the real Senator McCarthy. Nothing divides a nation like war, whether at home or abroad. By the late 1960s, America's military involvement in Vietnam split a country. The primary recipient of protest against the war was President Lyndon Johnson, who in 1967 continued to send American troops to fight in Southeast Asia.
The issue of the war of Vietnam was more than just a little mistake made in some strange, faraway country.
Vance Opperman was a law school student at the University of Minnesota in 1968 when he became the student leader for the McCarthy campaign.
It was a generational divide. It was seen as, on the one hand, the result of corrupt, uninformed, cynical politics, which I believe it was, and on the other, by people that wanted to be involved and felt that they wanted to have some role in their own government and felt they had been excluded from that process.
You could go down Pennsylvania Avenue some days and hear the chant right outside the White House fence of, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" I mean, it got very, very vicious.
The main thing, I think, were all the demonstrations going on outside. And Johnson, I don't know how Johnson reacted to that. I think that he thought they must be from not just unworldly, but from some other planet.
For too long, the political system has been a political system of bosses and of parties and of leadership. I mean, that great phrase, union leader and this kind of leader and that kind of leader. The people just don't dig their leaders.
The theory that the way to go to end the war was to build opposition to Lyndon Johnson within the Democratic Party, and that such opposition was possible because you could stand in any street corner and talk to your person on the left and the person on the right, and whether they had different positions on the war in Vietnam, they both hated Lyndon Johnson.
We were so angry with Johnson, and he was against Johnson, and that's all we needed. I still remember, saying to somebody, my dog, I don't think I even had a dog at the time, was running. Maybe somebody else said it, and we would support him.
Anti-war leaders Al Lowenstein and Curtis Gans started the Dump Johnson movement, and separately began seeking a Democratic candidate to challenge fellow Democrat, President Johnson, in his bid for re-election. U.S. Senators Robert Kennedy and George McGovern, among others, were all approached. They all said no.
He didn't want to be seen just as running against Lyndon Johnson as some sort of vendetta. He wanted to be seen as really stating out a position about the war in Vietnam and what needed to be done there.
So Lowenstein and Gans considered another option, Senator Eugene McCarthy from Minnesota. McCarthy hailed from the same state as Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey.
And along the way, at one point, I think we probably had 15 or 20 senators who had made some kind of challenging commitment against the war in '66 and '67.
I've been reading about your concern on the bombing. I understand the basis of your concern and doubt and perhaps fear.
So it became clear to me that the Senate was not going to, in any kind of effective way, challenge the war in Vietnam. The only thing left to do was really to make it an issue in the campaign. The fact that no one else would do it didn't, to my mind, say, if no one does it, I don't have to do it. The fact that if no one does it, you have to do it.
On November 30th, 1967, Senator Eugene McCarthy announced he would challenge President Johnson in primaries in Wisconsin, Nebraska, Oregon, and California. McCarthy later made a decision that would forever change the course of the 1968 presidential campaign.
Actually, the people in New Hampshire asked us to come in, and the troops were getting restless. You know, sometimes you got an army, you got to let them go, even though it shouldn't go. And so we were persuaded to go to New Hampshire.
They had legions of young people, but they were called Clean for Gene because they had pigtails, they had scruffy beards, they had beads, and if you were going to go out and campaign for Senator McCarthy and knock on doors and say, let me tell you why you should back this senator from Minnesota, the thought was you ought to clean yourself up. And so the name stuck, Clean for Gene, the young kids.